We have some time for questions. We have these portable microphones. What I'd ask is if you could tell us your name and your affiliation, and if you have a question for the panel in general or for a specific member of the panel, please let us know that as well. So questions? We have this young lady up here.
Thank you. Amy Butler with Aviation Week. I wanted to ask a question about long-range strike and joint strike fighter. In both cases, we don't know a lot in the public about what the actual cost of the final systems will be. So how did you base your assumptions on whether to or not to buy certain numbers of these systems and when to buy them without accurate cost data? And I'm curious, too, on the F-35 question, how did you balance that against the cost specifically for CNS against the F-15 Silent Eagle cost?
What I'm going to do is ask Todd to give you a sense of how he estimated the long-range strike bomber cost, and then any of our panel members who want to talk about their decision.
So, wherever possible, and for those two programs in particular, we went with the publicly available information DOD has published in the selected acquisition reports and in other budget documentation. So, we've seen what's in the budget request for both of those programs, and so that's what our costs were based on, whether, to add, to cut, to delay. That's where our cost numbers were based on. Now, with that said, whenever you're trying to estimate future costs, there's always uncertainty. And that's true of every single option in this database. There's uncertainty about everything. And so we did our best to stick with the official numbers that have been published by DOD wherever possible. I will say there are some options we put in there where DOD it's not something that's in the program of record, so there's not necessarily an official cost estimate. So we just did our best job, and you can blame me for the cost estimates. I did my best job to come up with these estimates for 800 plus items in our database.
Tom?
Yeah, I would just say we know a heck of a lot about F-35 costs. The one thing we don't know is what the unit cost is going to be, and that depends on how many we buy. So that's not a technological or, so that's not something Todd could figure out with his wizard machine. But in terms of what the technology costs, well, I think we've got like 98% visibility, actually.
Sidney Friedberg. I'm sorry, Nora?
Oh, there it is. Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay. You asked a specific question about how we balanced the F-35s versus the Silent Eagles. We cut the F-35 all variants, the A, B, and C, but in particular, we focused on the Navy having more options in terms of being able to buy other aircraft that would substitute for that, which we saw as prudent given the incredibly high costs of the F-35. We wanted to free up those savings, again, for all the services, but particularly with the Navy buy, to be able to reinvest in other things, and that's why we made those choices.
BreakingDefense.com. I noticed the remarkable consistency of cutting at least 2 carriers across all the 4 teams, if I heard that right. But as Mr. Berteau mentioned, if you stop building carriers, it's not like you can cut 10% of the carrier buy because it's huge ships that take multiple years to construct. So does those carrier cuts mean you keep on buying carriers continuously, you just start retiring the old ones and saving on overhaul costs, O&M costs? Or is there actually some way to say, okay, we're just going to buy fewer carriers and keep the old ones longer?
Dave, do you want to take that?
I can jump in here. None of the teams actually cut back on carrier construction. The reduction in the carrier fleet was achieved by, in some cases, canceling the refueling and overhaul of the George Washington that's scheduled to come up next, or retiring other carriers, existing carriers that are in the fleet.
There we go. From CSIS point of view, as I mentioned, our cuts in the current force were predicated upon a forward deployment capability that actually provided the same coverage that you have today. Had we not had that assumption available to us, or in the event, in reality, that didn't come to place, we would in fact have taken cuts elsewhere and have preserved more carriers.
Question over here.
Thank you. Richard Bertham from the British Embassy. Two of your four teams highlighted potentially different or increased roles for allies and partners in managing shared risks to us all. Secretary Hagel spoke along similar lines at the Munich conference recently. My question is, what sort of appetite in the wider political and strategic world here in Washington do you think there is for investigating these sort of possibilities?
Well, CSIS was one of the teams that focused on this. Our view is twofold there. One is that, in fact, the QDR process itself historically has been rather silent on the point of the magnitude of our reliance and projection forward on allies and partners. But I think that the change in focus that came out of the Defense Strategic Guidance in January 2012 should at least open the possibility for the QDR to be more robust in that regard. We'll find that out, obviously, in a few weeks. The second is, in fact, the ability, I think, of the technology to permit this. We run the risk, and we've seen this a lot over the last decade, where the vision of interoperability gets harder and harder because the gap between U.S. technological capability is actually widening with respect to our allies and partners. And it's going to take some conscious effort to, in fact, reshape that so that that gap is narrow rather than wider.
Tom?
Yeah, I would say, I've certainly observed that there's always whining in Washington about allied burden sharing and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we tend not to invest in the way that we ought to. Personally, I'm particularly interested in allies who are frontline states. The best thing about our allies is that they're over there and we can fight over there instead of having to fight at home. Particularly in regard to the Middle East, we have not treated our allies very well over the last 5 years.
Jim Thomas?
Yeah, I think we kind of lumped allies into two real groups. The frontline states, whether it's in East Asia or in places like the Baltics, where they needed to focus more on self-defense in terms of growing their own anti-access and area denial capabilities. And then we thought about allies that actually had projection forces. And for them, we thought about how could we more equitably share the risks and responsibilities of strike missions in the future. So things like our undersea forces and how we can improve not only undersea interoperability, but how we can encourage or promote our allies to expand their capacity for undersea warfare and be able to conduct unwarranted strikes from the sea. Or how they can increase their strike capacity in terms of aircraft. One of the things we did in our approach is we actually maintain some of our legacy bombers, like the B-1s. And this was actually done with an eye towards, in the future, would we want to think about, if we retired the B-1s, could we transfer them as excess defense articles to allies such as Australia, where that could improve their maritime strike capabilities?
Andy, could I add one more thing that I think is not directly associated with Richard's question, but it's relevant to what we all did. The department is having a hard time explaining to Congress the value of forward presence. And you see a lot of decisions. If each year you look at the report language in the bills, and you see basically those F-15s look a lot better in my state than they do in some other country, and so we made two assumptions there, and this is tied to the allies and partners. One is that we're not going to build any big new bases overseas, but because of that, we want to have an increased ability to use the bases of our allies and partners. Now, there's no place in the game actually to do that, but that was an assumption that we had, and I think all of us had that assumption to a greater or lesser degree. So that's an additional reliance that I don't think shows up automatically, but it's really an important element of the dynamic, and we need to explain that to those constituents that Senator McCain was talking about.
Nora?
We thought a lot about the role of allies in strategy and in how we would actually operate, but we didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the role of allies when it came to programmatic cuts, precisely because part of what Senator McCain said this morning about there being no backfill for U.S. forces. Frankly, a lot of the decisions of even our closest allies are very difficult to project out even a couple of years, much less 10 years. And so when we went through our allocations on the programmatic side, we were not focused as much on the role of allies and how their capabilities might substitute for ours.
Pat Towell?
CRS. Tom, you spent your 10 minutes crying in the wilderness, but then when Todd ran the numbers there, those last dozen slides or so, you did play fair. Do you have an elevator, and some of the cuts from the AEI team, I was very surprised. Do you have an elevator speech version of your rationale, say for your full BCA proposal? Thank you.
We took what I would consider a consistent strategic approach, which we probably we laid that out in the last iteration of this game. The things that we would be forced to do by the budget levels in the BCA would be to do things like essentially preserve maritime-based forces exclusively, or nearly so, for the Pacific Theater, and land-based forces exclusively for the Middle East. So we would kind of disaggregate jointness, if you will, to enable to try to, sort of spread the butter across the toast, recognizing that was going to increase the other forms of risk. So when we go down to, say, a carrier base that would only support 2 deployments at once, we would say they're in the Pacific 99% of the time unless there's a catastrophe.
Can I just add one thing to make sure I emphasize this well, is that all of the cuts that you see up there are not necessarily things that any of these people want to do. We forced them under these fiscal scenarios to be in a constrained budget environment. So really, I think the best way to characterize these things it's the things teams felt that they would do that would be the least worst alternative given the constraints that we gave them, not necessarily what they would want to do in an ideal situation.
Gentleman on the aisle there.
Hi, Rob Levinson, Bloomberg Government. I think it was CBO recently did a report about strategic forces and how much we're going to invest in nukes over the coming years, whether it's the new cruise missile, a new ICBM, the long-range bomber. There's a lot of money there. On the other hand, there's been a lot of strategic thinking about perhaps cutting back significantly on the nuclear force. And a couple of you addressed a little bit of that, but I'd be interested if you talk a little bit more about where you see the investments in nukes, and is there more money to be saved there?
Jim Thomas, you want to take the lead on that?
Well, I think this is an area where we really, over the next year or so, we really need to look hard at what the costs of the nuclear posture are. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me is I think probably the crown jewel of our nuclear triad is probably the undersea deterrent. It's the most survivable leg of the triad. But I think people forget we bought that capability more than 2 decades ago. So we haven't been paying for that in a long time. We obviously with O&M and things like that, but the procurement's there. So now we face another bill on Ohio replacement, and people want to jump out of windows over the size of the thing. And part of this is this sinusoidal curve of how we do procurement for some of our nuclear forces. It's got to change. We've got to find some way of amortizing those costs over time. But I would say that capabilities that for global strike, whether they're nuclear, conventional, non-kinetic, but they have this characteristic of being able to deter multiple adversaries simultaneously. And it really helps to reassure our allies and underscore extended deterrence, and it's critical for deterrence.
Tom?
Yeah, really quickly. The thing that we wanted most was a new, smaller submarine. We're going to live with the D5, obviously, but putting more boats in the water, particularly if warhead constraints come down, I do not want to pay, 196 warhead bill for every submarine in the water. So I want that new, smaller submarine so we can have a larger fleet that's a better deterrent, really a lot.
Yeah, I would add one other thing. CSIS looked at this from the point of view of the game itself doesn't let you look at the whole nuclear triad, because the real dollar impacts in this are only in 2 areas, the B-61 and the Ohio replacement that creeps in. And so we built an assumption that there is a longer-term strategic evaluation underway, and we didn't assume any outcome of that much beyond the status quo and the need to reduce dollars. But the crowding out effect that the Ohio replacement has in the shipbuilding, construction, Navy account is very dramatic and has to be addressed, not necessarily the way we did, but one way or the other.
Gentleman on the aisle here.
Hello, good morning. Howard Hall, National War College. I'd like to thank the panelists for a very interesting discussion this morning. My question has to do with validating the assumptions and assessing risk at the end. From what I understand, you did not have a preconceived notion of what the force would look like at the end of the game. You developed your assumptions, you developed your strategic construct, manipulated the software, came up with what the force would look like in the end. Was there a next step then to go back and validate the assumptions, or at least to assess risk on what that force eventually looked like going forward? That's for either the game coordinator or any of the panelists. Thank you.
Nora?
I think part of our strategy up front was deciding where we would accept risk. It didn't just come in at the end. We knew we would have to take risk in most of these moves, as Todd had said. So part of our strategy at the beginning, at least for our team, was to consciously say, where are we going to take risks? What missions can we afford to do that, and what missions can we not afford to do that in the timeline? And I think all of us did that. We might have come to different conclusions, but I think all of us were aware that you have to, under these budget conditions, say up front where you want to take risk.
Dave?
I think one of the things that this exercise showed us all is that we, and by we I don't mean the think tanks up here, I mean the U.S. government, the national security establishment, the Defense Department, and the military services, need a better way of actually articulating and quantifying risk as in something other than a binary fashion of acceptable and unacceptable. And until and unless we get that, we're going to be seriously constrained with our ability to balance the strategy with the resources that we're going to have, almost no matter what that level is.
Tom?
We certainly tried. We had a real clear idea of what outcome we wanted. We wanted to mitigate near-term risk in the Asia-Pacific and the Middle East. We sort of, through the various budget levels, got to various, you can only buy what the dollar amount would allow you. And we think we got to a sort of manageable or moderate level of near-term risk with our unconstrained level, but accepted pretty high risk in both other levels. So we tried very hard to get to that level of granularity on it.
Gentleman over here.
Jeff McNichols with the Bossa Consulting Group. With the Gates efficiency initiatives and Secretary Hagel's recent demands for cuts to headquarters personnel, I was wondering if the sides could explore a little bit further the thinking behind either to go massively in terms of DoD civilian personnel cuts or to largely dismiss those. I was wondering if you could explore a little bit further the assumptions and thinking behind that decision.
Here, I'll note up front that all of the Gates efficiency initiatives, the Panetta initiatives, and all the initiatives that came out in the last budget request, you add them all up, we're talking well over $250 billion over 10 years in efficiency initiatives that are already baked into the baseline. Now, if all of those efficiency initiatives come true, everything's fine, and the baseline becomes real. I think many, if not all of us, have our doubts that all of those efficiencies will prove true. But we gave people that assumption in the exercise that all of those efficiencies are already baked in there. And so then I'll let the teams comment on what they think you could do further.
Dave?
It's interesting to look at history here. When we did the reductions in the 90s at the end of the Cold War, it was dramatic reductions in DoD civilian end strength, well over 200,000 taken in the course of about 4 years. What we did not do as part of that is say, okay, what work are we going to stop doing? And we all know the result. Yes, the DoD civilian workforce went down, but the contractor workforce went up, and it stayed up as a result of that. Until and unless you actually have a structure that looks at the workload associated with this and what you're going to stop doing, it's just a budgetary exercise.
Dave, Tom?
I want to talk about the headquarters issue. I'm totally against the cutting of headquarters. The ability to run a large-scale campaign is a comparative advantage for the United States. Our allies can't do it. Fortunately, neither can our adversaries. That's something that that's an advantage we should enshrine and try to maximize.
Nora?
I think we were the team that took the heaviest cuts in DoD civilians. I think as I mentioned in my presentation, I think a large part of the reason for that is DoD civilians have increased tremendously over the past 10 years. It makes sense to, much more so than force structure or end strength. So it makes sense to bring them down in proportion, from that high, and then further in proportion to how you're cutting the military services. I think we all recognize the difficulties in actually identifying what the positions are and who would do that. I think DoD would probably benefit from some greater legislative flexibility in who it could let go as part of that. But I would highlight, if you don't, we were just talking about risk, right? If you don't make those cuts, you're going to have to take those cuts then either more out of military personnel, and I think we've all said that we all have accepted some risk that we're uncomfortable with, some more than others, on the size of the military, or you're going to have to take it out of readiness, again, to meet those short-term goals. And I think when faced with those choices, because we were able, the design here was to force us to make strategic choices, we looked at that and said, that's where you got to cut.
Okay, well, I see we're just about out of time. What I'd like to do now is just express my appreciation, not only to my colleagues at CSBA, but to our colleagues at our sister think tanks. It's not just the folks up here giving the presentations who put their time and effort and talent into this. At each of the think tanks, there's a staff of people that sat down, went through this process, spent a lot of their time and effort to do it. And I think it's remarkable in some sense that in many areas, even though along the line of the political spectrum, I think you can go from the moderate liberal to the moderate conservative here, there were some areas very strong agreement across this part of the political spectrum. And I'd also like to ask you to join me in a round of applause for these folks who put in all this time and effort. Finally, I'd like to thank you for taking the time from your busy schedules to join us today, and hopefully look forward to seeing you maybe if we put the band back together the next time we have another budget agreement. So again, thank you for attending, and be safe out there. Thank you.